What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, the crews return to the hobby horse once again to play another game and introduce a new player to the channel. First, we have Eric returning with the Simic Commander Volo Guide to Monsters. This deck looks to copy as many unique creatures as possible for ultimate value. Next, we have our friend Gavin making his first appearance on the channel playing Ruric Thar the Unbowed. This is a Gruul deck that looks to punish his opponents for playing non-creature based decks. Next, we have Fogrel playing Kurkesh Onakke Ancient. This deck is a strange artifact-based proliferate deck disguising itself as a mono-red Super Friends deck. Lastly, we have Justin playing his Golos Tireless Pilgrim deck for the first time and last time on the channel. This deck is a 5-color Kamigawa Myojin tribal deck that looks to cast Indestructible Myojin along with other Kamigawa legends. Luckily, we got to film at least one game with this deck before Golos got banned. Now that we have our fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Gavin starts the game by playing a Forest. He then taps one for Birds of Paradise. Fog plays a Great Furnace and passes. Justin draws and plays a tapped Frontier Bivouac. Eric plays an Ancient Tomb, then takes 2 to play a Simic Signet. Gavin draws and then plays a Rootbound Crag and passes. Fog plays a Mountain, then taps 2 for a pair of Lightning Greaves. Justin draws, plays a Plains, and then taps 2 for a Mazemind Tome. Eric draws and plays a land. He then taps enough, taking 2 from the tomb in order to cast his commander Volo. Gavin draws and takes 2 to play an untapped Stomping Grounds. He then taps 2 to cast a Void Mirror. Fog plays another Mountain, then taps 3 and casts Mudslide. At the end of Fog's turn, Justin scries 1 using his Tome. Justin taps for turn, then taps 2 for a Fellwar Stone and passes. Eric draws for turn, then plays a Verdant Catacombs. He then takes 1 to crack it, and then takes 2 more to get an untapped Breeding Pool. Eric then takes 2, tapping the tomb and a Signet to cast Uro. In response, Gavin casts Red Elemental Blast to destroy Volo. The copy of Uro hits the field first. Eric gains 3 life, draws a card, and then plays a Flooded Strand. The original Uro comes into play and gains 3 more life and draws another card. Volo then dies, and Eric takes 1 to crack the strand to go get an island. He then plays a Mox Opal and pays 3 to cast Growing Rites of Itlimoc, looking at his top 4 cards, revealing a Palinchron. Gavin plays an Arid Message for turn, taking 1 to crack it and going to get a Mountain. Fog draws for turn, then taps 2 for a Throne of Geth and passes. At the end of Fog's turn, Justin scries 1 with his Tome. Justin taps for turn, then takes 2 to play an untapped Sacred Foundry. He then taps 1 for a Wayfarer's Bauble. He then pays another 2 to crack the Bauble and goes and gets a Swamp and passes. Eric plays an Urza Saga for turn, then taps out, taking 2 to recast his commander. Gavin draws for turn, then plays a Taiga. He then taps out to cast his commander Ruric Thar. Fog plays another Mountain for turn, then taps 4 for an Empowered Auto Generator, taking 6 damage. At the end of his turn, Justin uses Tome to scry 1 again. Justin untaps for turn and plays a tapped Crumbling Necropolis. He then taps 5 to cast his commander Golos and goes to get a World Tree, putting it into play tapped. Eric untaps and casts Fierce Empath for turn, getting a second copy. He then tutors up a Consecrated Sphinx and a Craterhoof Behemoth. He then taps 4 for a Temur Sabertooth, getting a second copy. He then passes and flips his Growing Rites into Itlimoc Cradle of the Sun. Gavin draws and taps 3 for Jessica's Will, taking 6 damage, exiling his top 3 cards and getting 6 red mana. He then takes 6 to cast Rhythm of the Wild and then casts Seedborn Muse. He then goes to combat, swinging 6 commander damage at Justin. Fog draws, plays a Mountain, and taps 1 Mountain, taking 6 to cast Blasphemous Act in order to wipe the board. Fog then taps 4 to cast his commander Kurkesh and equips him with the Greaves. He then puts a counter on his generator and passes. At the end of Fog's turn, Justin scribes with a Tome, then sacks it, gaining 4 life. Justin untaps for turn, then taps out to recast his commander and goes to get a tapped Opulent Palace. Eric sacks his Saga at the beginning of his turn and searches up a mana crypt from his library. He then recasts his commander, which is then countered by Gavin with a Tybalt's Trickery. He then mills 1 card and then reveals the Sylvan Library, putting it into play. Eric then casts Twinning Staff and recasts Fierce Empath, tutoring up Avenger of Zendikar. Gavin draws and passes. Fog taps his Throne and sacks his Greaves in order to proliferate his generator counters. He then taps 1 to copy the ability with Kurkesh, putting a second counter on his generator. Fog then taps 4 to cast Everflowing Chalice, kicking it twice. He then taps 5 and uses 4 of it to cast Trading Post and uses the 1 floating to activate the ability, paying 1 life to create a goat token. Justin taps 3 for Rites of Flourishing and passes. Eric loses his mana crypt roll, taking 3, and then uses his library on his upkeep. He then taps enough to recast Volo. Once Volo enters play, Gavin kills him with an Unbowed. Eric then escapes Ura from his graveyard. He gains 3 life and draws a card. He then exiles the Scavenging Ooze and plays a Crow Mox. Gavin plays a Kessig Wolf Run, then casts a Jiraga Tree Speaker. He then taps 2 to level it up to 1. Fog draws and plays a Mountain for turn. He then taps 6 for Chandra, Awaken Inferno. Fog then uptakes Chandra, giving each opponent an emblem. He then taps the throne and sacks his chalice to proliferate all of his counters. He then pays the 1 red to copy the ability to Kurkesh, proliferating again. Fog then taps 1 and the 1 to copy the ability, sacking his goat to return his chalice and greaves back to his hand. He then casts a chalice for 0 and passes. Justin taps 2 for Nature's Lore, going to get a force, before tapping 5 to cast Time Warp, bouncing his commander to hand and destroying all creatures. Eric loses his mana crypt roll, taking 3. He then uses his library and then taps 3 for an Eternal Witness, getting his commander back from his graveyard, before recasting him again. He then recasts Temur Sabertooth, getting 2 extra copies. Gavin draws his cards for turn. He plays a Crag Crown Pathway and a Firelit Thicket for turn. He then taps out to recast Ruric Thar and passes. Fog draws to turn the recast Kurkesh. He then casts Liquid Metal Torque before tapping it to turn Chandra into an artifact. He then uptakes Chandra again and pays the 1 to copy her ability to Kurkesh, giving his opponents 2 more emblems. He then uses the throne to proliferate his counters, sacking the chalice. He then uses the Trading Post to pay a life and create a goat. Justin draws for turn to place an island and takes 2 to play an untapped Overgrown Tomb. He then recasts Golo and gets a tapped Arcane Sanctum. Eric loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3. He then uses his library and puts 2 cards back. Eric then casts Spark Double, and in response, Justin casts Tyrant Scorn to bounce Volo back to Eric's hand. He then makes Spark Double come into play as a copy of Temur Sabertooth. He then casts Palinchron and untaps 7 lands. He's then able to use his multiple copies entering the battlefield to create infinite mana. He uses this mana to recast his commander and to cast Avenger of Zendikar, getting 2 more copies, which creates a ton of plant tokens. He then shows us a loop of him casting Creator Hoof Behemoth, getting multiple copies, bouncing the original back to hand, and recasting it an infinite amount of times. He then goes to combat and swings out at all of his opponents, taking them out of the game. Today's big winner was Eric picking up a second win on the channel with the MVP of today's game, Volo Guide to Monsters. This is the 3rd time a Volo deck has made an appearance on the channel, and each time we've seen him, he seems to create more and more value. Being able to get multiple ETBs is really nice, but being able to get multiple ETBs along with extra bodies is an insane value. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you can see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.